All right, a U.S. judge has just ruled that an FBI terror watch list that is shared among the federal government and several of its agencies is unconstitutional and violates the civil rights of those on that list. Now, this is a major shift on how the so-called war on terror has continued nearly 20 years after 9/11. So joining us to explain this about-face from the government, investigative journalist Ben Swan. All right, Ben, so tell us a little bit about this judge, how he arrived at this ruling. I mean, what caused it?
Yeah, so the judge's name is Anthony Tringa. He's with the Eastern District of Virginia. He was a George W. Bush appointee from 2008. Essentially, he was ruling on a case where 23 Muslim Americans sued the federal government. They sued the FBI, saying they had been included on an FBI terror watch list that they shouldn't be on. And the judge agreed with them. Actually, and some of what he wrote is pretty incredible, saying this, quote, there is no evidence or contention that any of these plaintiffs, get this, satisfied the definition of a known terrorist. He says that anyone can be placed on this list, and they have no idea why they're on this list because there doesn't seem to be any methodology or criteria for why people are on the list. He also says that the people who are on the list maybe have never committed any kind of criminal act, have done nothing that should make them being suspected of terrorism, and yet they're on the list for some reason. And there's about 4,600 Americans on this list. So it's a pretty big ruling. Yeah,
that is incredible, Ben. Just the FBI could essentially just place anybody, you, me, if they want, on this list for any reason. So as you just mentioned, there are thousands of U.S. citizens like you and me on this watch list. What consequences has it had on their lives? What sort of impact?
Well, some of these plaintiffs essentially went into court saying that this has had a huge impact on their lives. It limits their ability to travel by airplane and to get onto flights, even though they're not on the do not fly list. It does still affect them in that way. Some have claimed that they could not get bank accounts opened because they're on this list. And again, what's really important about this, Manila, is that the inclusion on this list doesn't seem to make any sense because there's no set criteria for it. Again, this is something that the judge actually wrote here. He says the people who are on this list, he says they have not engaged in criminal activity, they have not committed a crime, and there is no evidence that they will commit a crime in the future. So if that is the case, what good does this list actually do other than to compile names of people, in this case, a lot of Muslim names of people in this country who are citizens of this country? It clearly violates their constitutional rights, their right to due process, because there is no due process, their right to challenge any of these claims that are being made, or even to have evidence brought against them that they are a threat to this country. So it's a very important ruling.
I mean, being on this list, does that basically allow the FBI to kind of monitor their actions, their daily lives, what they do? I mean, what kind of freedoms does this give the FBI or any other agency if your name is on this list?
Well, that's what we don't know. We don't know how the FBI has been using the list specifically, other than to monitor, as you said, the behavior of these people. The question becomes, though, at what point do you come off the list? If you're on that list for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I mean, we're 18 years after 9/11 now. We're about to hit that anniversary. And so you would have to ask the question, what good does this list actually do other than to compile people's names and give the FBI something to do? Again, we know that list is affecting some of these people in terms of how they live their daily lives and their inability to be able to, again, travel in certain ways freely, which is your constitutional right, in order to be able to open bank accounts. It is impeding their life in so many ways. How the FBI is using it is one thing, but why is the FBI using it? What is the value that comes from this? And why are names not being taken off the list instead of getting to the point where, again, you have 1.2 million names worldwide? 1.2 million. That's a lot of names and a lot of people on that list. 4,600 of those people are U.S. citizens. And yet how many of those 4,600 have ever even committed a crime? Certainly not an act of terrorism.
Well, Ben, you and I have talked a lot about this over the years and how, if your name appears on any sort of list or, some sort of watch, I mean, they're all lists, right? So they kind of give the government carte blanche to follow your actions, to even, in some cases, honeypot people and goat them into becoming terrorists. Talk to us a little bit more about how that spirals downward.
Well, that's, I think, the biggest threat in all of this, is that whenever the government begins to compile lists of names and people who they think are suspected or could be a terrorist in the future, there is a very dark process that begins that is often ignored by media. We've talked about it a lot. I've reported on it extensively. This idea that you have FBI informants who were recruited and then sent to go and try to essentially entrap people into this idea of committing an act of terrorism or committing a crime. And it's not just Muslims this happens with. It happens with a lot of different groups. And of course, when you get into court, when you get to court, the defense attorney wants to say, well, that's entrapment. The problem is that the legal definition for entrapment says that if you even for one moment have a thought that is of your own, to commit this crime, then it's no longer entrapment because you birthed this thought in your own mind. Even though many times these FBI informants are the ones who are goading people on, trying to convince them and talk them into committing an act of terror or a crime. It happens far too often. That's how many times the government makes cases against so-called terrorists. When they thwart an attack, it's almost exclusively that they planted the idea of committing the crime. So yes, you're absolutely right. A lot of times it's people from these lists that the government first puts their name on and then goes after them to find out if they're a terrorist, and in doing so creates a fake terrorist who was never going to commit a terrorist act.
Right, and therefore they become the heroes and thwart some sort of attack, and something's foiled in America.
That was never going to happen.
Right, but then we all feel safe, Ben, and then we're all good. But real quickly, I got to play devil's advocate. Isn't some of this monitoring absolutely necessary to thwart, like you were saying, to thwart some attacks? I mean, some of these are real, though.
So there are real people who want to commit acts of terrorism. I mean, for instance, we just saw this El Paso shooting a few weeks ago. That's clearly an act of terrorism. It's not an act of Islamic terrorism. Right. It's an act of white nationalist terrorism, but certainly it is an act of terrorism. But what is the FBI doing to actually find those people? Was this guy's name on a list? No, it wasn't. No. And so one of the problems is when you start to compile lists of people not based upon any criteria, not based upon anything that they've done, that violates constitutional rights. I don't care if the government says this could make us safer. It doesn't matter. We have a constitutional process that protects rights for a reason, because government has proven throughout centuries it is not capable of being able to look at things in a fair way. It misuses, it abuses, and it tramples on the individual's right. That's what this list has been doing. Hopefully it comes to an end. The problem is, the one negative out of this whole ruling from this judge is that he has not just ended this practice and abolished the list. He's now giving the government time to go back and try to clarify what process it will use and how it will go through this process and who should be and who should not be on the list. So he's actually giving them time to go back and kind of rework it a little bit, which frankly I think is wrong. Giving them a second chance at a bite at the apple. So we will see how this plays out. As always, appreciate your take on this. Ben Swan. Manila, thanks.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.